The nurse was hired to care for a woman in a vegetative state. One day, when no one was watching, she approached the woman. The gentle hum of medical equipment filled the room, blending with Anna's hesitant footsteps. The dim light cast long shadows on the sterile white walls, creating an eerie atmosphere. Anna, a young nurse in her late 20s, had just started her shift. Her new assignment was to care for Mrs. Thompson, a woman in a vegetative state. Anna had been briefed on the basics. Feed her through a tube, monitor her vitals, and ensure she was comfortable. However, the actual task was far more daunting. Anna paused at the door, her heart pounding. She took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room was small, with a single bed in the center, surrounded by various medical machines. The soft beep of a heart monitor was a constant reminder of the life that lingered in the room. Mrs. Thompson lay motionless on the bed, her face pale and expressionless. Her eyes were closed, and her chest rose and fell in a slow, steady rhythm. As Anna approached the bed, she noticed personal items scattered around the room. A framed photograph of Mrs. Thompson and her family sitting on the bedside table looked happy, and they smiled at the camera. There was a vase of wilted flowers, a stack of well-worn books, and a handmade quilt covering the lower half of Mrs. Thompson's body. These small touches of humanity contrasted sharply with the clinical setting. Anna reached out and gently touched Mrs. Thompson's cold and unresponsive hand. "Hello, Mrs. Thompson," she said softly. "I'm Anna. I'll be taking care of you from now on." Her voice trembled slightly, but she continued. "I hope we can get to know each other, even if you can't respond," Anna murmured. She set to work checking the tubes and monitors, her movements careful and deliberate, her training taking over as she went through the motions. Despite the routine nature of the tasks, Anna couldn't shake the feeling of unease. She glanced at the door, half expecting someone to walk in and tell her it was all a mistake, that she wasn't supposed to be there. But no one came. She was alone with Mrs. Thompson. Over the next few days, Anna settled into a routine. She arrived early in the morning, greeted Mrs. Thompson, and began her duties. She talked to her patient, recounting stories from her own life, describing the weather outside, and reading aloud from the books in the room. It was a one-sided conversation, but Anna found solace in the routine. She hoped, perhaps irrationally, that Mrs. Thompson could hear her and that her words brought some comfort. One afternoon, as Anna adjusted the pillows, she noticed something strange. Mrs. Thompson's fingers twitched just slightly. Anna froze, staring at the hand, waiting to see if it would move again. But it didn't. She told herself it was just a muscle spasm, a common occurrence in patients like Mrs. Thompson. Still, it left her feeling uneasy. Anna mentioned it to Dr. Harris, the physician overseeing Mrs. Thompson's care. She found him in his office, a small, cluttered space filled with medical journals and paperwork. "Dr. Harris, can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked, standing in the doorway. He looked up from his desk, his brow furrowed. "Of course, Anna. What's on your mind?" "It's about Mrs. Thompson," she began, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. "I noticed something unusual today. Her fingers twitched while I was adjusting her pillows. I thought it might be important to mention." Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "It's not uncommon for patients in vegetative states to have occasional muscle spasms," he explained. "But I'll note it and keep an eye on her. Thank you for bringing it to my attention." Anna nodded, feeling somewhat reassured. "I just wanted to make sure I was doing everything right." "You're doing a great job, Anna," Dr. Harris said with a small smile. "Keep up the good work." Back in Mrs. Thompson's room, Anna resumed her duties. As the days passed, she grew more comfortable in her role. She noticed other small details about Mrs. Thompson, the faint scar above her left eyebrow, the slight curl in her hair, and the way her lips parted ever so slightly when she breathed. These details made Mrs. Thompson seem more human, more real. One evening, as Anna read aloud from one of the books, she heard a noise behind her. She turned to see a man standing in the doorway. He was tall, with graying hair and a weary expression. He wore a suit, slightly rumpled as if he had been wearing it for days. "Can I help you?" Anna asked, closing the book and standing up. The man nodded. I'm James Jameson, he said. I'm Claire's husband. Anna felt a pang of sympathy for him. It's nice to meet you, Mr. Thompson. I've been taking care of your wife. He stepped into the room, looking at his wife with sadness and longing. Thank you, he said quietly. I appreciate everything you're doing for her. Anna watched as he approached the bed, taking his wife's hand. I talked to her, she said, needing to fill the silence. I tell her about my day. I hope it helps. James nodded, his eyes never leaving his wife's face. She loved to read, he murmured. Always had a book in her hand. There was a heavy silence in the room, filled only with the sound of the machines and Mrs. Thompson's steady breathing. In this intimate moment, Anna felt like an intruder but didn't want to leave Mr. Thompson alone. If you need anything, please let me know, she said softly. Thank you, Anna, he replied, his voice barely above a whisper. As the weeks turned into months, Anna and James developed a routine. He visited almost every evening, sitting quietly by his wife's side while Anna continued her care. They talked occasionally, sharing small snippets of their lives, but mostly, they sat in companionable silence. One day, as Anna tidied up the room, James spoke up. Do you believe she can hear us? Anna paused, considering her answer. I like to think so, she said finally. I think it's important to believe that our words and actions matter, even if we don't see immediate results. James nodded thoughtfully. I hope so, too. I want her to know that I'm here and haven't given up on her. Anna smiled gently, knowing that Mr. Thompson understood. She sensed their bond had grown stronger, united by their shared hope for Mrs. Thompson's recovery. Anna cared deeply for the family, feeling a sense of responsibility and connection beyond her professional duties. Every day, she entered the room with renewed determination, speaking to Mrs. Thompson with warmth and compassion, believing that somehow her presence made a difference. In those quiet moments, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment and whispers of hope, Anna felt a sense of purpose she had never known before. The weeks melded into a gentle routine, and Anna became familiar with Mrs. Thompson's room. She arrived with a fresh sense of purpose each morning, greeting Mrs. Thompson softly and beginning her meticulous tasks. The room, once cold and clinical, now felt almost homely with Anna's consistent presence and gentle touches. One quiet afternoon, Anna sat by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, reading aloud from a novel she had found on the shelf. The rhythmic sound of her voice filled the room, interspersed with the steady beeping of the heart monitor. As she read, Anna occasionally glanced at Mrs. Thompson's face, looking for any sign of recognition or response, but there was none. Suddenly, Anna felt strange, as if someone were watching her. She paused, the hair on the back of her neck standing up. She looked around the room, but it was empty save for her and Mrs. Thompson. Shaking off the feeling, she resumed reading, but the sense of being watched lingered, making her feel slightly uneasy. That evening, James Jameson arrived for his usual visit. He greeted Anna with a tired smile and took his place by his wife's side. Anna continued her tasks, but the earlier sensation still bothered her. She decided to confide in James. Mr. Thompson, she began hesitantly, can I talk to you for a moment? James looked up, concern in his eyes. Of course, Anna. What's on your mind? I've been feeling a bit uneasy today, she admitted. Earlier, while reading to Mrs. Thompson, I had this strange sensation, like someone was watching us. But there was no one else in the room. James's expression softened. It's not uncommon to feel that way in a place like this, he said gently. Hospitals can be eerie, especially when you're here as often as you are. Anna nodded, but the feeling still nagged at her. I just wanted to make sure I wasn't imagining things. You're not, James assured her. But don't let it worry you. You're doing a wonderful job, and Claire is lucky to have you. Anna smiled, feeling a bit reassured. Thank you, Mr. Thompson. I appreciate that. As the evening wore on, Anna's unease gradually dissipated. She continued caring for Mrs. Thompson with the same dedication and compassion, believing that her presence, words, and actions mattered, even in the face of uncertainty. In those quiet moments, she found a sense of purpose that sustained her day after day. Mr. Thompson, Anna began hesitantly, Have you ever felt like someone was watching you when you're here? James looked up, a curious expression on his face. No, I can't say I have. Why do you ask? Anna bit her lip, unsure how to explain. It's just, sometimes I get this strange feeling like there's someone else in the room. It's probably just my imagination. James nodded thoughtfully. This place can do that to you. Hospitals have a way of playing tricks on the mind. Anna nodded, relieved by his understanding. You're probably right. The days she was continued to pass in a blur of routine. Anna grew more attached to Mrs. Thompson, feeling a deep sense of responsibility and care. She often talked to Mrs. Thompson like a friend, sharing stories and little details about her life. One day, as Anna was arranging the flowers on the bedside table, she noticed a faint movement out of the corner of her eye. She turned quickly, but Mrs. Thompson lay still, as always. Anna frowned, her heart racing. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different. Determined to understand, Anna began to pay closer attention to Mrs. Thompson's subtle reactions. She noted any slight changes in breathing or any flicker of movement. Her observations, though minor, began to build a picture that suggested there might be more going on underneath the surface. Anna decided to confide in Dr. Harris again. She found him in his office, going through his usual stack of paperwork. Dr. Harris, can we talk? She asked, her voice steady but insistent. He looked up, noticing the serious expression on her face. Of course, Anna. What's on your mind? I've been noticing some changes in Mrs. Thompson, Anna began, choosing her words carefully. Subtle things, slight movements, changes in her breathing. It might be nothing, but I feel like there could be something more happening. Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, considering her words. It's possible, he said slowly. Patients in vegetative states can have periods of minimal consciousness. These changes you've noticed could be signs of that. I'll review her records and monitor her more closely. Anna felt a surge of hope. Thank you, Dr. Harris. I want to ensure I'm doing everything for her. You're doing a great job, Anna, Dr. Harris assured her. Your dedication makes a difference. Anna resumed her duties in Mrs. Thompson's room with renewed determination. She continued to observe and record any changes, feeling a growing sense of connection and purpose. In those quiet moments, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment and the whispers of hope, Anna felt more confident than ever that her presence mattered. I've been noticing some small changes in Mrs. Thompson's condition, Anna began, choosing her words carefully. Subtle movements, changes in her breathing. I think there might be more going on than we realize. Dr. Harris leaned back in his chair, considering her words. It's possible, but we have to be cautious. Patients in vegetative states can have involuntary movements. It doesn't necessarily mean they're regaining consciousness. I understand that, Anna replied. But I think it's worth looking into. Maybe there's something we're missing. Dr. Harris sighed, rubbing his temples. All right, I'll look closer at her next time I do my rounds. But don't get your hopes up, Anna. Thank you, Dr. Harris, Anna said, feeling a mixture of hope and apprehension. Anna resumed her duties in Mrs. Thompson's room with renewed determination. She spoke to Mrs. Thompson more deliberately, watching closely for any reaction. Days turned into weeks, and Anna's patience began to wane, but she remained vigilant. One quiet evening, James arrived as usual. He seemed more tired than average, his shoulders slumped with the weight of unspoken worries. Anna decided to share her observations with him, hoping it might give him a glimmer of hope. Mr. Thompson, I've been noticing some small changes in your wife, she said gently. I've spoken to Dr. Harris, who will look into it. I just thought you should know. James's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of hope breaking through his weary expression. Do you think there's a chance she might wake up? I don't want to give you false hope, Anna replied carefully, but I do think it's possible. There's more going on than we can see. James nodded, a hint of a smile touching his lips. Thank you, Anna. It means a lot to know you're paying such close attention. As the days continued, Anna remained dedicated to her duties, her hope mingled with caution. She watched for any signs that might indicate a change in Mrs. Thompson's condition, no matter how small. In those quiet moments, surrounded by the steady hum of medical equipment and the ever-present hope, Anna felt a deep sense of purpose and connection, believing that her care could make a difference. I just thought you should be aware. James nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Thank you, Anna. That means a lot to me. Anna's bond with Mrs. Thompson and her husband deepened as the weeks passed. She felt a sense of purpose and connection she hadn't experienced in her previous assignments. Her dedication to Mrs. Thompson grew stronger, fueled by the minor signs of hope she observed. One tranquil afternoon, as Anna sat reading by the bedside, she felt a slight pressure on her hand. She looked down and saw Mrs. Thompson's fingers move ever so slightly. Her heart skipped a beat as she stared, hardly daring to breathe. Mrs. Thompson, she whispered, her voice trembling. Can you hear me? There was no response, but the slight movement of the fingers made Anna's heart race with hope. Her mind buzzed with possibilities, and she decided to inform Dr. Harris immediately. Dr. Harris, it's Anna, she said breathlessly as she found him in the hallway. I just felt Mrs. Thompson's hand move. It was slight, but it was real. Dr. Harris looked at her, a mixture of skepticism and curiosity in his eyes. Are you sure it wasn't just another muscle spasm? I'm sure, Anna insisted. Please, just take a look. Dr. Harris followed Anna back to the room, observing Mrs. Thompson closely. After a few tense minutes, there was another slight movement of her fingers. Dr. Harris' eyes widened slightly, and he nodded. All right, Anna, we'll run some tests and see if we can find any more signs of improvement. Anna felt a surge of relief and gratitude. Thank you, Dr. Harris. I believe there's something there. The following days were filled with anticipation and cautious hope. Anna continued her vigilant care, watching for any further signs of movement or awareness. The bond between her and Mrs. Thompson grew stronger as she maintained her dedicated routine, speaking to her with warmth and compassion. As Anna tidied the room one evening, she felt a presence beside her. Turning, she saw James standing there, his eyes filled with hope and fear. Anna, he began softly, do you think she might return to us? Anna paused, meeting his gaze. I believe there's a chance, Mr. Thompson. We have to hold on to hope and keep fighting for her. James nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. Thank you for everything you're doing. I don't know how we would get through this without you. Anna smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. We're in this together. Mrs. Thompson is lucky to have such a loving husband by her side. As the days turned into weeks, Anna's unwavering dedication and the minor signs of progress gave the Thompsons renewed hope. In those quiet moments, surrounded by the hum of medical equipment and the whispers of possibility, Anna found a profound sense of purpose that sustained her day after day. Thompson and James grew stronger, united by a shared glimmer of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, Mrs. Thompson was beginning to wake up. Anna felt a profound connection and purpose as she sat by the bedside one evening. The journey was far from over, but she was determined to see it through, no matter how long it took. The unseen bond between them gave her strength, and she knew they would face whatever came next together. As Anna entered Mrs. Thompson's room the following day, the air was heavy with anticipation. The slight movement of Mrs. Thompson's fingers the previous day had reignited her determination. She greeted Mrs. Thompson with her usual soft tone, but her voice had an underlying excitement. Good morning, Mrs. Thompson, she said, smoothing the blanket. Today will be a good day, I can feel it. Anna began her routine, meticulously checking the tubes and monitors to ensure everything was in order. She took her time, observing every detail, hoping for any small improvement. As she worked, her mind wandered to the journal she had found among Mrs. Thompson's belongings. A leather-bound book filled with handwritten entries. She hadn't had the chance to read much of it yet. But today, she felt compelled to dive deeper. Anna sat in the staff lounge during her lunch break with the journal. The pages were filled with memories, thoughts, and reflections. Mrs. Thompson's handwriting was neat, each word carefully penned. Anna found herself engrossed in the life of this woman she barely knew yet felt so connected to. The entries painted a picture of a vibrant, intelligent woman who loved her family dearly. There were mentions of her husband, James, and their children, along with anecdotes about their lives together. Anna smiled as she read about their family vacations, holiday traditions, and the little moments that made up their lives. But as she continued reading, the tone of the entries began to change. The once cheerful notes turned somber, filled with worry and uncertainty. Mrs. Thompson wrote about feeling watched and sensing something wasn't right. There were mentions of strange occurrences and a growing fear that someone was trying to harm her. Anna's heart raced as she read these words. The last entry was the most disturbing, speaking of a car accident, an event that seemed to be the culmination of all her fears. Mrs. Thompson had written about her suspicions, feeling that the accident was accidental. Anna closed the journal, her mind reeling. Could it be possible that Mrs. Thompson's condition was not just an unfortunate accident? She felt a knot forming in her stomach. She needed to find out more. That evening, James arrived for his usual visit. Anna decided it was time to share her findings with him. She waited until he had settled into his chair by the bed before speaking. Mr. Thompson, she began cautiously, I've been reading Mrs. Thompson's journal. There are some things you might want to know. James looked up, his expression a mix of curiosity and concern. What kind of things? Anna hesitated, choosing her words carefully. She wrote about feeling like she was being watched and about a car accident that she believed wasn't an accident. I think she suspected someone was trying to hurt her. James's face paled, and he leaned back in his chair, absorbing her words. I knew she was worried about something, but I didn't realize. Do you think there's any truth to it? I don't know, Anna admitted, but I think it's worth looking into. There might be something we're missing. James nodded slowly, his eyes filled with determination. We need to find out what happened. Claire deserves the truth. The next day, Anna approached Dr. Harris again. She explained what she had found in the journal and her growing suspicions. Dr. Harris listened attentively, his expression serious. Anna, these are serious allegations, he said finally. If there's any truth to this, we must proceed carefully. I'll review Mrs. Thompson's medical records and see if anything stands out. Thank you, Dr. Harris, Anna said, hopeful and apprehensive. As the investigation began, Anna found herself more deeply involved. She spent her free time researching Mrs. Thompson's past, looking for clues supporting her suspicions. She reached out to colleagues and friends, trying to piece together the puzzle. One afternoon, as she was organizing Mrs. Thompson's belongings, Anna found another clue. A stack of letters tucked away in a drawer. They were addressed to Mrs. Thompson from various people, including her husband and friends. Anna carefully read through them, looking for anything unusual. One letter stood out. A friend mentioned a heated argument she had witnessed between Mrs. Thompson and her husband shortly before the accident. The friend expressed concern for Mrs. Thompson's safety, suggesting she be careful. Anna's heart pounded as she read the letter. Could James have had something to do with the accident? The thought was almost too much to bear, but she couldn't ignore the possibility. She decided to confront James with what she had found. That evening, when he arrived, she took a deep breath and approached him. Mr. Thompson, I found something else, she said, her voice steady but her heart racing. Handing him the letter, James read it, his expression growing more troubled with each word. I remember that argument, he said quietly. It was about money. Claire was worried about some investments I had made. We argued, but I would never. I loved her, Anna. Anna felt a pang of sympathy but also a renewed sense of determination. I believe you, Mr. Thompson. But we need to find out who might have wanted to hurt her. There's too much at stake to leave any stone unturned. James nodded, his resolve firm. You're right. We need to find the truth. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Anna and James worked together, digging deeper into Mrs. Thompson's life and the accident's circumstances. They spoke to friends, colleagues, and anyone with information. Dr. Harris, too, diligently reviewed the medical records. He found inconsistencies that suggested possible tampering, further fueling their suspicions. Anna's unease grew, but so did her determination to uncover the truth. One evening, as Anna sat by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, she felt a strange calm. She took Mrs. Thompson's hand and spoke softly, as she always did. Mrs. Thompson, we're going to find out what happened to you, she whispered. We're not going to give up. I promise. As she sat there, the room filled with the quiet hum of the machines, Anna felt a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just a nurse caring for a patient. She was a protector and an advocate for the truth, and she was determined to see it through, no matter what it took. The tension in the air was palpable as Anna entered Mrs. Thompson's room. The puzzle pieces were slowly coming together, and the reality of what might have happened to Mrs. Thompson weighed heavily on her. She was determined to uncover the truth, but she knew the journey would not be easy. Anna continued her daily routine with Mrs. Thompson, but her mind constantly raced to piece together the clues. She had shared everything she found with James and Dr. Harris, and they all agreed to proceed cautiously. There was a growing sense of urgency as if time were running out. One afternoon, as Anna was preparing Mrs. Thompson's medication, James arrived, looking more agitated than usual. He had a determined glint in his eyes that Anna hadn't seen before. "Anna, we need to talk," he said, his voice tense. Anna nodded, setting aside the medication. "What's going on, Mr. Thompson?" "I've been thinking a lot about what we found," he began, his hands clenched into fists, "and I believe we're onto something. But we need more concrete evidence. I've been going through Claire's financial records and found some discrepancies. There are large sums of money that are unaccounted for." Anna's eyes widened. "Do you think someone was stealing from her?" James nodded. "It's possible. I've contacted a private investigator to help us dig deeper. We must find out where that money went and who was involved." Anna felt a surge of hope. "That's a great idea, Mr. Thompson. The more information we have, the better." As they spoke, Dr. Harris entered the room carrying a file. His usually calm demeanor was replaced with concern. "I've been reviewing Mrs. Thompson's medical records," he said, joining them, "and there are some troubling inconsistencies. It appears that some of her medications were altered, possibly to keep her in a vegetative state. I've consulted with a colleague who agrees that something is off." Anna's heart pounded. "So someone has been deliberately keeping her in this condition?" Dr. Harris nodded gravely. "It seems so. We need to find out who and why." Anna felt a renewed sense of urgency. They were getting closer to the truth, but the stakes were higher than ever. She knew they had to proceed carefully but was more determined than ever to see this through and bring justice for Mrs. Thompson. "It seems that way. We need to proceed carefully but act quickly. If someone is responsible for this, they need to be stopped." James's face darkened with determination. "We can't let them get away with this. Claire deserves justice." The three agreed to work together, each using their strengths to uncover the truth. James continued to dig into the financial records with the help of the private investigator while Dr. Harris focused on gathering medical evidence. Meanwhile, Anna kept a close eye on Mrs. Thompson, looking for any further signs of improvement. Days turned into weeks, and the investigation began to bear fruit. The private investigator uncovered a series of suspicious transactions linked to a shell company. Further digging revealed that the company was tied to Dr. Carlson, a colleague of Dr. Harris who had been treating Mrs. Thompson before Anna's arrival. As she learned of Dr. Carlson's involvement, Anna felt a chill run down her spine. She had always felt uneasy around him, and now her suspicions were confirmed. They had a name and motive but needed more evidence to bring him to justice. One evening, as Anna was about to leave for the night, James stopped her. "Anna, the investigator has found something. Dr. Carlson has been receiving large payments from Claire's accounts. We believe he's the one who's been tampering with her medications." Anna felt a surge of anger. "We need to confront him. He can't get away with this." James nodded. "We've arranged a meeting with the investigator and a lawyer. We need you there too, Anna. Your testimony will be crucial." The next day, they gathered in a small conference room. The investigator laid out all the evidence, including financial records, medical reports, and testimony from other staff members who had noticed Dr. Carlson's suspicious behavior. Anna felt nervous and determined. This was their chance to bring justice to Mrs. Thompson. As they prepared to confront Dr. Carlson, Anna couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. They were dealing with a dangerous individual, and there was no telling how he would react. But she knew they had to press on. The confrontation took place in Dr. Harris' office. Dr. Carlson arrived, looking confident and unaware of what was about to unfold. Anna, James, Dr. Harris, and the investigator were all present, ready to face him. "Dr. Carlson," James began, his voice steady, "we need to discuss Claire's condition and some disturbing findings we've uncovered." Dr. Carlson frowned, glancing around the room. "What is this about?" The investigator stepped forward, presenting the evidence. "We have proof that you've been receiving payments from Mrs. Thompson's accounts and that you've been altering her medications to keep her in a vegetative state." Dr. Carlson's face turned pale, but he quickly composed himself. "This is preposterous. You have no proof." "We have more than enough proof," Dr. Harris said firmly. "And we're prepared to take this to the authorities." Anna watched as Dr. Carlson's facade began to crack. He glanced around, realizing he was cornered. "You don't understand," he said, his voice shaking. "I did what I had to do. Claire was going to ruin everything." James stepped forward, his voice filled with controlled anger. "You tried to kill my wife for money. You won't get away with this." Dr. Carlson looked desperate, his confidence shattered. But there was no way out. The investigator had already contacted the police, and they arrived shortly after to take him into custody. Anna felt a wave of relief wash over her. They had done it, they had exposed the truth. In the days that followed, news of Dr. Carlson's arrest spread through the hospital. Anna continued caring for Mrs. Thompson, but her actions showed a new sense of hope and determination. She knew justice was being served and was more committed than ever to helping Mrs. Thompson recover. James visited more frequently, staying by his wife's side and talking to her, hoping she could hear him. Anna noticed more small improvements in Mrs. Thompson's condition, slight movements, changes in her breathing, and occasional eyelids flutter. One evening, as Anna sat by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, she took her hand and spoke softly. "We did it, Mrs. Thompson. We found the truth. You're safe now." Mrs. Thompson's fingers twitched slightly, and Anna felt a tear roll down her cheek. She knew they still had a long road ahead, but for the first time, she thought they were moving towards a brighter future. She was determined to be there every step of the way. The sun had just begun to set, casting a warm golden glow across the hospital room. Anna stood by Mrs. Thompson's bedside, her heart filled with hope and determination. The past few weeks' events had been overwhelming, but there was a renewed sense of purpose in her actions. They had uncovered the truth, but now they needed to see Mrs. Thompson through her recovery. James entered the room, his face softened with a hopeful smile. He had been visiting more frequently, spending hours talking to his wife, holding her hand, and reading her favorite books. Anna had noticed the positive effect it seemed to have on Mrs. Thompson's condition. There were more frequent flickers of movement, more changes in her breathing patterns, and even the occasional flutter of her eyelids. "Any changes today?" James asked, pulling up a chair next to the bed. Anna nodded, her eyes shining with optimism. "I've noticed more movement in her fingers. It's subtle, but it's there. I believe she's trying to respond." James's smile grew wider. "That's wonderful news, Anna. Thank you for everything you've done." Anna smiled back, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. "We're in this together, Mr. Thompson. I'm just glad to see progress." As they continued their vigil, the room filled with a comfortable silence, punctuated by the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor. Anna sat on the other side of the bed, gently holding Mrs. Thompson's other hand. "Mrs. Thompson," she began softly, "we're all here for you. You're surrounded by people who care about you. Take your time, but know that we're waiting for you." James nodded, his voice filled with emotion. "Claire, I miss you so much. I can't wait for you to open your eyes and return to us. I love you." The hours passed slowly, but the sense of hope in the room was palpable. Anna and James continued to talk to Mrs. Thompson, sharing memories, stories, and words of encouragement. As the night deepened, Anna felt a growing sense of anticipation. Suddenly, there was a slight movement. Mrs. Thompson's hand twitched more noticeably, her fingers curling around Anna's. Anna gasped, her eyes wide with astonishment. "Mr. Thompson, did you see that?" she exclaimed, her heart racing. James leaned forward, his eyes fixed on his wife's face. "Claire, can you hear us? If you can, please give us another sign." Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Mrs. Thompson's eyelids began to flutter. Anna and James watched in breathless anticipation as her eyes slowly opened. It was as if time stood still, the world outside fading away. "Claire," James whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "it's me, James. I'm here." Mrs. Thompson's eyes moved, focusing on James's face. A tear rolled down her cheek, and her lips parted, trying to form words. As she watched this miraculous moment unfold, Anna felt tears streaming down her face. "James," Mrs. Thompson whispered, her voice weak but unmistakable. James broke into tears, leaning forward to kiss her forehead. "I'm here, Claire, I'm here." Anna stood back, giving them a moment to reconnect. She felt an overwhelming sense of joy and relief. After all the hardship and uncertainty, Mrs. Thompson was finally waking up. The days that followed were filled with cautious optimism and steady progress. Mrs. Thompson's recovery was slow but steady. She regained her strength, and her speech improved with each passing day. Anna and James were there every step of the way, offering their unwavering support and encouragement. Dr. Harris monitored Mrs. Thompson's condition closely, adjusting her treatment as needed. The investigation into Dr. Carlson's actions continued, and he faced charges for his crimes. The hospital staff marveled at Mrs. Thompson's remarkable recovery, and everyone praised Anna's dedication. One afternoon, as Anna was helping Mrs. Thompson with her physical therapy, they had a moment of quiet reflection. "Anna," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice still soft but growing more robust, "I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. You saved my life." Anna smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. "It wasn't just me, Mrs. Thompson. It was a team effort. We all believed in you, and you found the strength to return to us." Mrs. Thompson reached out and squeezed Anna's hand. "You gave me hope when I had none. I'll never forget that." As the months passed, Mrs. Thompson's condition continued to improve. She was eventually discharged from the hospital and could return home with her family. Anna stayed in touch, visiting regularly and offering support as Mrs. Thompson adjusted to her new life. The bond between Anna, Mrs. Thompson, and James grew stronger. They became more than just patients and nurses, they became friends, united by their shared journey. Anna found a renewed sense of purpose in her work, inspired by the incredible strength and resilience she had witnessed. One sunny afternoon, as Anna sat in the garden with Mrs. Thompson and James, she reflected on everything they had been through. The journey had been long and complex, but it had brought them closer together and changed their lives forever. "Life has a way of surprising us," Mrs. Thompson said, her voice filled with warmth. "I never thought I'd be here, sitting in my garden with the people I love most. But here we are, and I'm so grateful." Anna nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment. "We've been through so much, but it's made us stronger. And we have a future to look forward to, filled with hope and new beginnings." As they sat together, enjoying the sun's warmth and the garden's beauty, Anna knew that this was just the beginning. They had faced their darkest moments and emerged victorious. Now, they had a lifetime of possibilities ahead of them, a testament to the power of hope, love, and unwavering determination. At that moment, surrounded by the people she had come to care for deeply, Anna felt a profound sense of peace. They had found justice, and Mrs. Thompson had found her way back to those who loved her. It was a journey that had transformed them all and would continue to inspire them for years. Your story is deeply touching and captures the essence of human resilience, compassion, and the power of hope. Anna's journey from a hesitant nurse to a determined advocate for Mrs. Thompson is inspiring. The story beautifully illustrates the impact of unwavering dedication and the profound connections that can form in adversity. The setting of the sterile hospital room gradually becoming a place of warmth and hope through Anna's care is powerful. The development of Anna's character, from feeling uneasy and uncertain to becoming a pillar of strength and hope for Mrs. Thompson and James, is compelling and well executed. James's portrayal adds an emotional depth to the story, highlighting the toll a loved one's suffering can take and the unyielding love and hope that keeps him going. The discovery of Dr. Carlson's malfeasance adds a layer of suspense and intrigue, making the story a touching tale of recovery and a gripping narrative of justice and truth. The climax, where Mrs. Thompson begins to show signs of recovery, is heartwarming and triumphant. It is a powerful reminder that hope and perseverance can lead to miraculous outcomes, even in the darkest times. The conclusion, with Mrs. Thompson's continued improvement and the deepened bonds between the characters, leaves the reader with a sense of fulfillment and optimism. Overall, your story is beautifully crafted, highlighting the strength of the human spirit, the importance of compassion, and the relentless pursuit of truth and justice. It's an emotional and inspiring read that resonates deeply,